as an African economy, I've been able to raise finance from the private sector relatively cheaply, not worried too much about some of these sustainability concerns.
Hello and welcome back to the Bankers Masterclass series on Africa's growth prospects in association with Absa. I'm James King, the Bankers Africa and Middle East editor, and with me is Jeff Gable, head of research at Absa. In this next chapter, we will be discussing the continent's growing debt challenge and its implication for some of Africa's key economies. The IMF and World Bank have released some data this year in which they point to the fact that the number of African economies in high levels of debt distress has doubled since 2013. So is the continent now facing a new debt crisis?
It's certainly more difficult now than it was before. If you look in sub-Saharan Africa for those IMF numbers, they're now showing that 15 out of the 35 countries that they do the work on are either at high levels of concern or in distress. And that number was just 6 in 2013. So there's been a big development there. It's not so much that Africa has more debt than it's ever had. If you go through the 1990s and early 2000s before the debt relief programs, debt levels were higher, but certainly we're well off our base. In percent of GDP terms, it's gone up from about 25% for public debt about a decade ago to roughly double that now. But it's beyond that, right? And it's beyond that in that it's different types of debt. We've had this remarkable period of global money being very easy. So you used to owe some private creditors, but much more the multilaterals like the IMF, some bilateral debt with individual countries. Now you owe the market. And that's going to be a very different process than what we've had before.
So what are the implications of that changing composition of debt? What does that really mean for African governments?
Well, I think there's probably two phases here, right? The first part was it was probably easier than it should have been to ring this debt up. Back before, when your first point of call in terms of raising finance was to the IMF or others, the IMF would say, well, we can see how this amount of money would be useful to you, but to access this amount of money, you're going to need to do those sorts of things because you want to be quite confident that you're going to be in position to pay us back. In an environment where large swaths of global, of the inputs to global bond indices have been yielding negative returns over the last better part of a decade, well, a lot of that nuance has been lost, right? So as an African economy, I've been able to raise finance from the private sector relatively cheaply, not worried too much about some of these sustainability concerns. So that's the first phase, right? I was able to generate a whole bunch of debt over this period because people were stuffing my pockets with it. The second phase of this is going to be much more difficult, right? Because the taps, right, from global markets, well, certainly that tap is being turned off. Maybe not yet, but we can see the direction that's going. And at the same time, you have a population, right, that's demanding more and more and more services. That's a very difficult environment. And so what I think ultimately we're going to see is the IMF and others becoming much more involved in the continent again.
Okay, so I was going to ask you, governments across the continent are facing have tighter fiscal positions, they have growing debt problems, so in order to drive their economies forward, what can they do? Is it turning to the IMF? Is this the answer?
Well, certainly I think those discussions are going to become more forthright, not for everybody, but for those countries that have seen the largest increases. So there's often a question, and this is not unique to Africa, but there's a question of sort of what makes debt sustainable. And so the IMF and others do some very detailed work, but let's think about this in a very practical way. As a government, I have an ability to raise revenues each year, largely through tax revenues. Maybe I get it in some other ways as well. If I want to spend sort of 10p in every pound on servicing old debt and only 90p in every pound of new tax revenues providing new services today, is that sustainable? Probably yes. Is 20p in every pound? Less clear. Is 30p or 40p? And those are the challenges that we have because we have a number of economies in Africa that have gone through exactly that mechanism. Used to spend very little on debt service, now spending sort of 1 in 5 pounds of tax revenue just servicing the old stuff. Some that are spending 4 in every 10, some 5 in every 10. those are the countries where the situation is becoming much more difficult, much more quickly. Those are the places that we're going to have to engage the IMF and others and get those countries on a more sustainable footing. And throughout all of this, I should reiterate, right, as much as we focus on monies being spent on public sector servants and whether deals were done in the right way or the wrong way, through all of this, there's an insatiable demand for infrastructure. And that's not just sort of road and rail and airports. In Africa, often that's very basic infrastructure. It's making sure that there's an education system that can produce sort of the young adults that we will need to take the continent forward in the years ahead. It's around basic health services. That's what the voters want, and governments across the continent are going to have to be continuing to provide that if they want to have any hope in the polls.
Okay, and taking that longer term view then, so what are the implications of tightening US monetary policy for the continent as it moves forward?
It's going to be trickier, right? Because you have public finances are already more strained now than they were before. You were able to do that because global money was so easy, and perhaps the US is sort of leading the normalization of global monetary policy, but others will follow. Right? It's going to be more difficult to raise cheap finance going forward than it was in the recent past. That's going to have everybody, not just people in Africa, that's going to have markets everywhere tightening belts. And so on the African continent, part of that will be governments looking to be more reformist by themselves, others prompted for more reform from the IMF and others. And a third angle of this, which is probably quite interesting, will be sort of an acceptance from African governments that they can't provide everything. And so I think you're going to see much more openness and acceptance, particularly around things like infrastructure, that it's time for much more private sector involvement.
Jeff, thank you very much.
Thank you.